What? First of all, what does Puparia mean? It is the plural form of the word puparium, which is the hardened shell of a pupa. The pupa is the stage of metamorphosis for certain insects. By itself, with what we're seeing right now, it doesn't tell us very much. But the meaning of it will become clearer as we go on. Then we see two letters. I don't speak Japanese, so I went online to ask for help and learned that these two letters mean chrysalis and dream. Already, we have another reference to metamorphosis, this time with chrysalis instead of pupa, which is the specific word for the pupa of butterflies. It is accompanied with the word dream, shifting the meaning of it into something more elusive and psychological. As such, it is not the chrysalis and the puparium simply in a literal sense anymore. And maybe the purely literal approach to it has to be almost ruled out entirely, because if you pay attention to the background, we're already dealing with heavily ambiguous imagery. By itself, this alone would remind one of something that could be seen in a dream. With this, we enter into the psychology of the unconscious, and its inherently ambiguous territory. The abstract patterns and unrecognizable shapes make themselves into a gateway to the unconscious for both the artist and the viewer. From this mass of confusion, anything could emerge, and that is ultimately the inherent potentiality of the unconscious psyche, conveyed here through the imagination. The next scene opens up, and we are introduced to relatively recognizable figures this time. There is a sitting girl looking and blinking at us, with a rather neutral expression. And she's not the only one looking at us. In the background, we can see a kind of sea lion, covered in a pattern resembling the ambiguous shapes of the previous scene. It really looks more like a fantasy creature with its two waving appendages and strange hind legs. The most striking thing about it might be its big human eye that is also looking and blinking at us. On its head and in the air, we also see yellow glowing butterflies flying across the view. The girl and the creature are both sitting in a garden, which is overgrown but also walled, with various structures decaying inside it that one would see in a city. Despite the clear imagery and recognizable figures we're being given, it still feels difficult to really guess what this is supposed to be about. If you take this to be a psychological process, an evaluation of the unconscious, as already mentioned with the ambiguous imagery from before, we could say that what we're observing is a progressive differentiation of the various forms that were before held in an undifferentiated state in the unconscious. In other words, as consciousness emerges from the natural grounds of the unconscious, like slowly awakening from a dream, it becomes more and more defined by shapes and objects we can all consciously recognize. Hence, we see in this emergence out of nature hints of civilization come into the picture, although the unconscious identity with nature still has the upper hand in this environment, at least for now. While the girl represents the emergence of a typical human perspective, with a deeper meaning that I will dive into later. The the unconscious still has a strong influence through this fantastical creature in the background. Since it is largely undifferentiated, mixed with various different animal qualities, it can be taken as a symbol of the unconscious background that still exists even if there is more influence from the world of consciousness that is starting to define the forms of reality around it. The girl steps out of the picture. What this means is something I could only speculate about at this point, but as I said before, I'll bring her up again later. With the blinking creature as the only one left, we can observe that through becoming conscious, the ego comes into a relationship with the unconscious that seems to be aware and observing us like we are observing it. But it still has not taken on a form where we can say that there is any specific meaning or communication happening. The next scene is abruptly different and a total contrast to the previous one. Here we now observe all the instinctual life of the psyche from before infused entirely into cultural forms. All of the previous wilderness of nature has become contained in architecture, vases, rugs, or mirrors. Through this process of self-reflection, the instinctual energy has taken on clearly defined forms. It seems like we have emerged out of the unconscious identity with nature from childhood earlier on and entered into the world of adulthood. A man walks into the scene. He's not wearing the usual attire for such a fancy environment. He's just in his underwear, presumably trying to enter the door to his room. We see a painting, a vase, and also an ornamental animal skull. The skull especially gives an even stronger impression of the supremacy of culture and consciousness over the unconscious and nature here, showing that it has essentially been eliminated by it. But something else is starting to make its presence felt, as he looks into the endless doors and hallways. For some strange reason, he has two different eye colors. A normal colored right eye and a red left eye. On top of that, they are also looking in different directions. Rushing out of the darkness comes a strange, hovering creature. Still, the man only looks at it with one eye. This might indicate the existence of a split, an inner division. If you take him to be the ego, emerged out of the unconscious, it would only make sense that he would be in a divided state, disassociated from the unconscious. All the previous expressions of nature now have been entirely mastered and shaped into definite cultural forms, forms which do not have a life of their own, like the sea lion creature we saw earlier. Him wearing no clothing shows that he has no protection from this confrontation of the unconscious. He's not shielded from it by the virtue of his social identity, status, and persona. In the culturally dominated world of society and adulthood, the unconscious is largely left behind because it doesn't actively include it in its picture. And as usual, it is at the expense of a living harmonic relationship with it. And despite all the attempts to keep it within defined constraints in these various cultural objects, it emerges from a totally unexpected place. It makes itself known first just as a feeling, a hunch, that he seems to have a reluctance to directly face. One side of him wants to stare down and pretend it doesn't exist. Which makes sense considering how scary it is to suddenly have the feeling of an invisible presence. But this fear of the unknown is also faced without hesitation from his conscious side. His courage is ready to bear witness to the thing that culture itself tried to eradicate out of existence, the thing that all these material objects around him try to contain. As it returns, it takes on a surreal, immaterial, or simply put, psychic form. Out of the shadows of ego consciousness comes this rather strange-looking creature. We can connect it to the title and calligraphy from earlier, since it has the shape of a chrysalis. It also has similar colors and patterns as the sea-lion creature and the original ambiguous shapes in the beginning. This return of the psychological and instinctual grounds of consciousness holds in itself, if we expand on the meaning of it as a chrysalis, the potential for transformation. As such, it is a figure of the unconscious, yet again, holding in itself a potential existence of an ego unified with its unconscious shadow. Since he is in a split state of being, the mending of this split is a crucial cure he absolutely needs. In it is the potential for an existence that would allow for both consciousness and the unconscious to exist in relative harmony, or at least without petrifying into cultural forms that lack a living meaning, as is the case here. It appears as some kind of entity that exists in this liminal space, an adversarial shadow of the ego, when in reality it is a door opening up new possibilities that are beyond the limitations of the ego. Then we come upon the shortest of all the scenes. A woman looks up at us with surprise, but quickly distances herself, squinting a little and turning away from us. She's standing in front of a very wild background. There is a wild growth of colors, long blades of grass, and most prominently, these huge, winding roots. The mystery embedded at this point in the environment and the figure is on a whole different level. Just like in the scene transition from before, we are again introduced to a total contrast. The previous neatly contained cultural forms have been burst open by a wild growth, although mostly on a subterranean level. If we look at this as a continuation from the previous scene, we could say that the consciousness from the man from before, after having freed himself from the limitations of culture and ego, is looking even further beyond, for the potential of an even greater unified existence by connecting to the other human half, the feminine. His ego and shadow unifying in the chrysalis gave him the brilliant insight of how the personality can feel at one with itself. Having gone through the pain of attaining that inner knowledge, the psyche aims to unify even grander and more contrasting opposites that are impersonal and collective at scale, instead of just his personal ego and shadow. This doesn't go as planned though, because as she turns away from us, or him, she points to another direction. As I said before, this scene contains a lot of mystery, and I'll definitely return to expand on it later. But for now, let's follow our guidance. With this last scene, we might actually be entering an even greater mystery. The woman from before, if she was this other side the man had tried to connect with, points almost deliberately to what appears to be this kid and this fox. Through this, we might be getting a hint of what they represent. They are standing at the edge of a platform, in front of a set of stairs. They are looking towards the horizon, across a kind of ocean or desert, which contains similar ambiguous forms as we have seen from the very beginning. On the horizon, we see rising dark clouds and red shimmering lights, although the kid and the fox both seem to have set their eyes on a single bright white light. The kid is covered again in similar patterns as we have been observing throughout the animation, and holds a short but trusty eye contact with the fox, who takes its own steps towards the horizon. The kid, while recognizably human, gives now full expression to the previous patterns that express the unconscious itself, making it an embodiment of total paradox. This would make it a unification of consciousness and the unconscious, holding the full weight of a psychologically unifying symbol. But not just of the ego and shadow as with the chrysalis, since it also holds in itself various impersonal opposites. This figure has the appearance of being young, despite having white hair. Its ambiguity of being a boy or a girl also gives expression to its all-encompassing characteristics. The kid seems to suddenly notice that it is being watched by a large crowd. They look at it with various kinds of expressions. Some are intrigued, bewildered, suspicious, shocked, and even totally captivated. The kid turns away as the light behind it is growing brighter. It turns to us once again and gives us a smile, only for it to suddenly turn away again as if called by something. And with this, the animation ends. Now with this, I have skipped over many details, but my goal was to establish a relatively straightforward basis to build on. For an abstract work like this, without any discernible plot and no dialogue, speaking mostly just in imagery and facial expressions, it is important to have a basis like this in order to be able to dive deeper into it without losing oneself in the ambiguity. Because at this point, sure, what I said about its psychological parallels might shed some light on it, but by itself it is just pointing at a door. The meaning of it is something that has yet to be illuminated, and the question of why it would exist is left unanswered. But before we dive into it again, let's anchor ourselves on some things the artist Shingo Tamagawa himself said about his work in a short documentary by Archipel. He says that after a hiatus in the anime industry, ideas started to flow which would eventually turn into Puparia. He created the animation for the sake of carving the feelings he experienced during this time, which he most clearly expresses by stating that he had a strong feeling that the values shaping our world, the things we believe in, are gradually falling away. That the things we used to hold up as good or important were starting to collapse. And he thinks he isn't alone in this feeling. As a result, he didn't want to pretend that he got the right answers, and focused on making something encouraging. He felt like we couldn't be ourselves anymore, and at the same time couldn't see what the future was holding for us. I think I'm not the only one agreeing with Tamagawa-san, saying he isn't alone in this feeling. To take such a large problem into your soul is a tremendous weight. What we are facing here as a world is a crisis. And more profoundly, we are also witness to an answer through Tamagawa-san's dedicated effort and creative ambition. But how exactly is what he has made an answer to such a crisis? It does not seem in any shape or form obvious that the animation he has made would emerge from such a feeling. Nonetheless, what he created clearly resonated with a vast amount of people. Sure, one could say that it is purely appreciated for its aesthetic value. And while that alone, with the 3 years that it took to create, makes total sense, I think the existential undercurrent in the work makes it particularly intriguing for our current times. At the risk of saying too lofty things about the situation we're existing in right now, let's return with this new context to the animation itself and try to understand it with this extra layer of meaning. I've already been using various psychological terms in order to identify the things we observed, but I have not yet taken out the central conceptual terms in order to orient ourselves through the scenes. This might seem like a strange coincidence, but we are able to apply specific terms that can be found in the analytical psychology of Carl Jung to specific scenes. The shadow is one that I've already mentioned, but the others I've only hinted at through describing how they appear. Maybe it is better to first ask, why would I include Carl Jung's psychology after what Tamagawa-san has expressed? In a very simplified way, we could say that Tamagawa-san has attempted to look into the unknown in order to see what could emerge after he had noticed that our current values are fading away. As a result, through this internal journey, he has come upon the structures of the psyche, from the personal to the archetypal dimension. This approach of letting the unexpected emerge from the unknown is something he quite directly states, saying that he worked at each scene up until he completed it, only starting with the next one after the previous one was completed, not knowing what he would end up with next. This makes Jung's ideas very relevant, because he describes in his map of the psyche the changing phases of the unconscious the deeper you go into it. For now, let's simply start from the beginning again. With our new perspective in mind, this beginning from a primordial soup starts to make a bit more sense. If you're gonna enter the unknown as an artist, you have to begin with this unformed, ambiguous mass. Nobody can know what comes after the old has fallen away, and we can never know unless we look into the unknown. The pure mass of potential is actually a common initial state of chaos, which Jung traced in various cultures, especially in alchemy, where they called it the Latin name massa confusa, or prima materia, the confused mass, or the first matter. It is the precondition to a journey of transformation, which is necessary given the old ways of being have become invalid, at least for the individual called to go on their own journey. In this way, the chrysalis dream takes on a much clearer meaning, focusing on metamorphosis and the falling away of the old shell. The first scene that emerges is rather comforting. I made a parallel in my initial analysis that this seems to reflect a consciousness that is in the developmental stage of childhood. Nature still rules over the blurry memories, and the imagination is at least determining half of reality. Now, I could already apply a certain term from Jung on the girl we see here, and I previously said I would dive into her deeper meaning later, but I feel it is not yet a good time to do so. I promise I will speak of her more clearly soon. The sea lion, or rather the hybrid creature or chimera, is a typical symbol for the unconscious that contains undifferentiated contents and hence leads to a merged and imagined form like this. Again, in this state the unconscious is still in a relationship with consciousness, a peaceful and serene one, like existing in the original paradise, full of soulful butterflies and sprawling wonder. although differentiation and technology are starting to creep in and separate the opposites, as we can subtly see in the contrasting red and blue on this object and her shoes, bringing in sharpened contrasts. Through her standing up and leaving this scene, we are witnessing the end of that original childhood bliss. Because as the psychological horizons are continuing to widen, we are brought to the threshold of the current one in order to enter the next. The cultural forms that were already making their subtle appearance now have completely taken over. We are taken out of childhood, brought into the life of adult responsibilities and civilization, with the only thing left that might be from the past being a sometimes hard to admit nostalgia for simpler times. The man, not wearing a typical attire that represents his social identity, is vulnerable to these distant influences. Really, they are not distant at all. They exist right behind us. And hence Jung called this shadow of consciousness the shadow. The lost instincts return, because through the sterile forms they have atrophied, driven away by cultural and rational forces, or contained into forms that would inhibit their free autonomy. At least, if one purely looks at them through a material or rational perspective, which is the dominating point of view. The psychological forces are not so easily stamped out, and hence come at the man with an unrelenting force, in a completely unexpected, immaterial, spiritual, or simply psychic form. The trickster aspect of the shadow always escapes our attempts at having a purely rational order. What this means for a person to confront the shadow is to admit to the sides of ourselves we would really not like to admit to. Sides behind a social mask, a persona, in order not to just have some privacy, but even hide from ourselves sometimes. Through being able to face the fear and have the courage to admit to our weakness and potential faults, we really begin to be able to have proper personal agency. Otherwise, all our intentions can be subverted by this inner adversary who is all too easily projected as blame into the world. But the man here clearly has no other choice. No longer under the protection of a society-approved persona and an appearance of having it all together, he is forced to experience the disintegration and inner split. While it doesn't show us the results of shadow integration directly, focusing on these short scenes purely on the thresholds, the experience of shadow integration is often followed up by inspiration and insight. From that point onwards, you can recognize things that exist far beyond the personal sphere of experience. While the problem of personal guilt has been dealt with, and the person feels at one with themselves, what becomes perceptible is a much larger problem. This time something more akin to what Tamagawa-san mentioned before in the documentary, about the falling away of our values. Hence Jung says that after the crisis of the shadow myth comes to a close, the saviour myth will be hinted at. This saviour of the greater crisis emerges in the form of a woman, as the archetype of the anima is being constellated for the man. Jung would say that the opposite generally is true for a woman, where the archetype that is constellated is called the animus, representing her unconscious masculinity. These concepts have been questioned more and more as time goes on, but I think the point wasn't to establish some conceptual dogma by Jung, but more so put emphasis on the contrasting experience of how we relate to the inner world and the outer world. It seems to almost be the rule that the persona or face we show to the world has a completely contrasting side to it behind the mask, which only shows itself when we are more private or alone, if at all, This conflict expresses itself in two seemingly irreconcilable inner and outer aspects, which, after shadow integration, become a more apparent conflict. If we bring up the red and blue contrast again, she's clearly leaning on being the missing red half. As such, we are brought to long for a solution and seek that other contrast that is hidden from us on the inside in someone who seems to embody these qualities. The difficulty in crossing the threshold and challenge that is constellated by the archetype of the soul is something that challenges us on a moral and spiritual level. An ordeal by fire, as Jung called it, which is hardly ever achieved. One reason for this is because this time, the power of the unconscious doesn't merely represent a shadow of the personal unconscious, but opens up the door to the collective unconscious. This progression, while completely unique to everybody, is a linear one, and the next horizon only opens up when the previous ordeal has been truly walked through. Even in Tamagawa-san's approach to the work, he felt the previous scenes were necessary as part of the overall progression. With this, as mentioned before, the ego dreams of an even higher unity than that of him and his shadow, and he puts all his hopes into his soul and whoever he projected onto in order to regain an ultimately lost unity, which we can recall to be missing long ago in that childhood garden. The girl in this scene, if we go by the interpretation, is also the anima, but existing here in the form that recalls the unconscious identity with her in nature, when the mother was the source of the world, or maybe later on an older sister. The return of such an ideal unity is of course a huge cause of trouble for the man and the woman, because they end up projecting all their hopes for that ancient heavenly oneness into each other, while at the same time coming to terms with the fact of their empirical human reality. In any case, the personal trouble this causes is almost evident in her reaction to, presumably, the man who observes her. A disappointment of some kind, maybe in her or in him. Either way, this contact with a harsh truth seems to be part of the course to lead us to the next threshold as she points the way. This rising conflict and collision of our wishes and reality have brought to the surface an unfathomable solution. Purely going by the colors this time, red and blue have become the greatest of allies. Through these figures, we observe a completely unified relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The animal element is no longer missing or sought in a person, but now has become a guide as the fox scouts on ahead. But where are they going? It seems that this figure now has become the ideal of our relationship to our collective crisis. It is guided by an internal connection to the instincts, able to face the challenge head on and entering into the unknown future beyond the horizon. The only way forward for us. It is not yet a solution to the crisis itself, but in this form shapes the attitude towards the crisis that one can ideally aspire to. And with this, we have reached the all-encompassing symbol of the psyche, or as Jung also called it, the archetype of the self. This most common yet rare symbol, fully embracing the paradox and the solution to our conflicting internal and external contradictions, has made itself seen here in captivating fashion. Everybody is stunned by being witness to this. I'm not sure if these people know what this figure is intending to do, but if they knew, they probably would think this kid is crazy. Who would be so bold to enter the unknown so fearlessly? Some definitely can't help but admire that fact, or at least reluctantly respect it. And some are totally captivated, unflinching in their focus and longing to become someone like them. To end this excavation of a psychological answer to a crisis, emerging in the purest form out of the unconscious through the imagination, I want to read something Jung once quoted in his books, written by the Stoic philosopher Seneca in a letter to Lucilius, almost 2,000 years ago. It might seem out of place, but I think there exists a surprising overlap. He wrote it in a similar time as ours, when the world was undergoing drastic changes. And perhaps we can make use of this Stoic idealist description of a profound character in the face of an unstable world. We push one another into vice. And how can a man be recalled to salvation when he has none to restrain him and all mankind to urge him on? If you see a man who is unterrified in the midst of dangers, untouched by desires, happy in adversity, peaceful amid the storm, who looks down upon men from a higher plane and views the gods on a footing of equality, will not a feeling of reverence for him steal over you? Will you not say, this quality is too great and too lofty to be regarded as resembling this petty body in which it dwells? A divine power has descended upon that man. When a soul rises superior to other souls, when it is under control, when it passes through every experience as if it were of small account, when it smiles at our fears and at our prayers, it is stirred by a force from heaven. A thing like this cannot stand upright unless it be propped by the divine. Therefore, a greater part of it abides in that place from whence it came down to earth. Just as the rays of the sun do indeed touch the earth, but still abide at the source from which they are sent, even so the great and hallowed soul, which has come down in order that we may have nearer knowledge of divinity, does indeed associate with us, but still cleaves to its origin. On that source it depends. Thither it turns its gaze and strives to go, and it concerns itself with our doings only as a being superior to ourselves. This sounds grandiose, but what does it actually look like? We always prefer a fantasy hero over the real story, which mostly consists of laborious and solitary dedication, something that no one would envy. Because what Tamagawa-san made here is not something that a Stoic idealist like Seneca imagines out of a longing for heroism. No. The source of this creative effort is actual lived experience. The comparisons might be striking. The fact that someone 2,000 years ago described a personality smiling, related to the sun or some kind of divine light, and turning its gaze from us, almost reads like Tamagawa-san shaped his animation through the words that Seneca wrote a very long time ago. Ultimately, I don't know if he did. Similarly, I don't know if he read Jung and mapped his sequence to the map of the psyche that Jung laid out, with the shadow, anima, and self. But I'm going to make the bold assumption here and say that this is the natural result which the archetypal basis of the psyche constellates when it is faced with confusion. Obviously, Jung himself makes that claim too, very directly even. But it is hard to prove that this could be the case. Maybe I've been speaking from a very narrow perspective. After all, what I just did so far in this video is combine Jung's knowledge with Puparia, ending it on a quote from someone who lived in ancient Rome. I'm essentially just placing knowledge and history that comes from my own cultural atmosphere on something that has been made in a very faraway region, which, sure, has a lot of contact with the one I exist in, especially nowadays. But can I really just recall something written 100 years and something else 2,000 years ago and claim it is justified to give expression to something made by someone with a totally different cultural history? It might be better to take a step back and continue observing Tamagawa-san's dedication without claiming that I have given expression to what his work of art might have been trying to convey. Let's look into other aspects which led to the shape of Puparia by watching more of the documentary. He says that because the thing he is trying to give expression to is rather abstract and difficult to understand, his goal was to make the characters and the background to be clear and without deception. In his opinion, the characters are close to the ones you'd find in manga, and he also likes the symbolism in manga. He says that sometimes the symbolism in manga can be seen as cheap because it expresses its meaning too plainly, which is something he wanted to avoid, except in the characters, which he says expresses feelings clearly. They have come to life through his own emotions. Already, I feel like I'm not sure what to even add to that, because I can't think of any examples of these cheap uses of symbolism in manga. I find it almost a kind of inverse perspective. I feel that in many of the stories in modern media from what I'm surrounded by lacks even examples of cheap uses of symbolism, because it's really not all that popular here. When I look at the theaters or streaming services, I mostly observe stories that focus on a plot, an unfolding situation with a conclusion. Not so much vague imagery that might be too clear or confusing in what it expresses, generally. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but I'm simply pointing out that whatever I can say about Tamagawa-san's work is heavily limited in giving proper expression to Puparia's meaning. Frankly, the ideal that formed itself in his life, to pursue even the possibility of making an animated short alone and work in it for 3 years, is something I can only consider as alien. Him describing the experience of sometimes just cleaning drawings or scanning all day is an almost unfathomable kind of meditative concentration to me. His ideal in my eyes, if I would give it the most commonly thrown around word that could be fitting to describe it, would be something like self-expression. But even then, anything that I imagine from that word doesn't even come close to this type of wholly invested pursuit of expressing himself in full honesty. And I can't make sense of what could truly lead to such a deeply inner pursuit. In a way, I'm like the crowd in the animation itself, looking with awe, totally captivated and at a loss for words. Even if it might not seem that way, considering I've been speaking for quite a while now. Like, even just his use of colored pencils instead of digital color and needing to invent a whole new style just for this work alone, so he could achieve the look that is up to his standard, is a wild and bold decision to me. I feel like if I think of experimental ways of creating animation, movies, or games that blow me away on this level, I would see a seemingly endless credit scene afterwards. Totally to the contrary in this case, there is only a single animator that follows up the end of the animation. If you look into animation or other media coming from the West, you often notice huge team sizes working on a single project, into the thousands sometimes even. While in the East, or at least in Japan, the teams tend to be much smaller, especially their core teams. And I'm just curious, and I'm gonna ask, why is that? It seems to me, if you look at it from a purely contemporary view, the answer could be found in many different directions. And often one would come upon something like, it just always has been done that way. I'm not here to do an economic or socioeconomic analysis about the development of media companies, because I think the root of it might go much deeper. If we look into Jung's writings, we find examples of him comparing the difference in perspective between Western and Eastern religion. While it is a hugely difficult task to do so, especially in his time where the contact between the two was just really starting, he did seem to find some very peculiar generalities, of course always with their exceptions. Jung looked into religion because from a psychological point of view, they formed an essential expression of ancient human culture, which he describes as containing the characteristic of giving full expression to the human personality, involving us in a complete cosmos. He looked at them through the lens of phenomenological psychology and didn't try to argue with the metaphysical or theological assertions of the religions, but more so asked the question, why would we make such assertions in the first place? Through his own findings, he came to the conclusion that these metaphysical statements have a psychological origin, which doesn't mean that they are merely made up, but that in the psyche there exists a domain of experience which gives rise to these transcendental descriptions. The ego can't help but be deeply impressed by them and take them to be important factors that constitute the fundamental orientation of existence. Underlying these all-encompassing cosmic perspectives is what Jung called the experience of the numinous. And it leads to a sort of recollection that furthers the awareness and concentration of consciousness on these impressive factors, and almost as a byproduct creates culture. Now, without deviating from the original question too much, and ask what all of this could mean when examined more closely, Jung's statements about the difference between West and East was that the numinous, or the symbol of the self, was in the West leaning more towards the external, or extroversion, while in the East it was more internal, or focused on introversion. As a result, over many years, in the West we reached a point where our focus is on mastering the external world. And as a consequence, we've run into a situation where we've neglected the inner world. He even says that our neglect is so massive that the whole existence of psychology is rooted in the fact that we can no longer ignore our inner side. Otherwise, we could do without it, as we have mostly done so for a very long time, because we felt the external gave proper expression to our subjective side. For the greater part of 2 millennia, we've been gathering in churches, experiencing worship among a community, while in the East, the ideal was very different. In fact, it seems to be almost entirely the opposite. This is a daruma, or also called a daruma doll. These are very popular in Japan, and their purpose is to be a kind of good luck charm. One would get them for a wish, or a goal one wants to achieve, and while keeping the goal in mind, an eye of the daruma would be colored. Once the goal has been achieved or the wish has been fulfilled, the other eye would be colored in as well, and at the end of the year, they would all get burnt in a pile together. Now, the history of this doll, I think, spans into the past 300 years, but the figure it represents, Daruma, is much older than that. Daruma, or more commonly called Bodhidharma, is said to have been from South India, although according to Japanese legend, he was from Persia, a wild foreigner and Buddhist monk, who is said to be the originator of Zen Buddhism. He isn't a defining figure of Zen in Japan, and Zen isn't even the most popular form of Buddhism in Japan, even though many relate Zen and Japan very often together, but he has made his way into becoming a Daruma doll. The reason one only has the head of the Daruma is because he is said to have stared at the wall for 9 years, in pursuit of his own ideal of focusing on the all-permeating Buddha nature, which he thought was replaced in the Mahayana Buddhism of his time by paying too much attention on the written concepts instead of the direct experience. During this long meditation, he is said to have lost his arms and legs. They just fell off his body. And that's why the Daruma only has a head. From a Western perspective, again, this seems totally absurd. It might seem so as well to a modern person from the East, but there is a tendency for us in the West to almost assume a kind of pathology when hearing of such an experience. This form of intense concentration is something we maybe recall from anchorites, so there are always exceptions. But in general, our focus on the mastery of the external world is not familiar with this kind of internal mastery. The internal mastery of the East and its high ideal mode of preserving inner discipline among all external turmoil has made its way into the West, very prominently in our internet age, through the word mindfulness. And all the mindfulness apps one can download to guide one into a mindful meditation. This frankly superficial adoption of an incredibly sophisticated description of the inner landscape from various Eastern cultures leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Not because I think we shouldn't focus on inner mastery, or we shouldn't pay attention to what the East has to say about it, but that we do it in a blandly Western way, turning it into a tool for the purpose of serving our external goals, completely missing the point and blindly continuing with our bias. To become a master of the inner world, to the degree that your arms and legs would fall off, is something we would never, ever truly consider. So, for the sake of understanding our history better, after I just made a short history lesson with the Daruma, let's ask ourselves the question, where do our ideas come from? If we look at the defining characteristics of our conscious attitude, expressed in our standards of science, our stories told in movies, and of course religion, the overall cosmic pattern is always of opposition. Good versus evil, true versus false, with a future orientation of a final triumph of the good and true. Hopefully. Science claims we find the truth through objectivity, which relies mostly on external or what we call empirical evidence. While the idea of good and evil was mostly spread through Christianity, we can trace it further back to someone else. Oddly enough, just like the Daruma was, according to Japanese legends, we can find the origin of this moral divide in another Persian called Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. His cosmic perspective is rooted in the conflict between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the Lord of Wisdom versus the evil spirit, in their battle of the Asha and the Druj, the truth versus the lie. This contrast, according to historical sources, influenced Judaism around 2,500 years ago and also flowed through ancient Greek philosophy and then found its way into Christianity, turning into the conflict of Jesus and the devil. This is completely at odds with what was taught by the Daruma or the Buddha. These two Persians, or at least one real and one supposed Persian, Zoroaster and Daruma, one spreading influence to the west and the other to the east, somehow were influential in defining the cosmic perspective of vast regions. One of them held the cosmos to be a divine conflict, and the other claimed that there was no conflict at all, and it's just an illusion we have to transcend. Dualism spread to the west, and non-dualism spread to the east. It almost seems like a prank. That the fundamental ethos of two regions would be completely opposed in their cosmic perspective. Again, there are of course exceptions and overlaps, but I find it very peculiar that this is the result of human culture. To lead this back to the original question that led to this whole tangent into history, I think it has an influence on why the West generally has larger studios creating art and entertainment than the East. The soul of humanity seems to have expressed itself in these different ways and given form to different perspectives, both entirely true and functional in their own ways, but also both being one-sided. I don't have an answer of why it is this way, other than just like with individuals, people have their unique psychological typology, some being more introverted and some more extroverted. But with this comparison and journey, I feel I got a better understanding of the goal Tamagawa-san pursued in making Puparia. To bring it back to the original point, when he talked about the values of the world falling away, I think we can observe that for both East and West. The cultural forms of our ancient history have lost their ultimate meaning for many people. This seems to be the case. The feeling of a story expressing what we feel in our innermost soul seems to now demand a different form, or at least a different perspective. Many people look towards anime and animations, the works like Tamagawa-san's, made by someone alone or in smaller teams. He spoke of feeling like their animation ambitions had been defeated by the West when he saw the Spider-Verse movies. He felt the animation surpassed Japan in its ambition. In our Western style, focusing on external organization, it was a huge group effort, with around 1,000 animators working on Across the Spider-Verse. At the end of the documentary, he speaks a little about the state of the industry. The kind of approach he took in doing what he does is stupid. If the bottom line is to be productive, his approach is totally nonsensical. But being productive, creating a product, is a very narrow and, for lack of a better word, soulless endeavor. I don't have anything against productivity, offering valuable, important, and useful things to the world. But that alone can't lead to a life where humanity finds fulfillment. It doesn't help that we are developing, extremely quickly, new tools to save time in all sorts of ways, especially in creative fields. While I was writing this script, a new AI video generating model just released that not only generates video, but also audio, voice, sound effects, and music built into it. And now, while I'm recording and editing the video, a second leap of video generating models has been released. If the fire has gone out in the old forms that used to be the guiding ethos of our life, and we are on all sides encroached upon by our mastery of nature, where technology is hollowing out everything, simply reusing the forms that already exist, I think our choice to find that lost fire again has become a matter of necessity. And however different the perspective of the East and the West might be, I think we can agree that Tamagawa-san's statements that he creates for the sake of generating new emotions is at this point a vital one. The perspective I just covered involved many huge leaps. But really, I'm just an individual trying to find my own way in this life. As much as I can describe myself as someone from the West, it's not like I treat it as a thing very personal to me. Even being part of Europe is a vast and impersonal force when I really think about it. Hell, even Switzerland or just Zurich is a culture and perspective I don't find myself to be exactly truly represented by. The extroverted tendency of the West is already a very dubious one to me. I don't go outside much. I spend most of my time in this room in front of my computer. So my focus in life is quite different from what might define my region. Ultimately, life is not lived by a region. It is lived by individuals in that region. Only individuals make meaningful personal choices and experience fulfillment in their lives. It is an extremely hard to remember fact that society is rooted in the individual. But of course, we also always exist in relationship to something or someone else. A central idea that Jung spoke a lot about is that of individuation. One might confuse it with something like individualism, but that would be a total mischaracterization. A person who goes on the path of individuation is a very solitary and self-determined one. That is absolutely the case. But it is a pointless one if it doesn't exist in a relationship to the collective. The call to individuation is something that is not chosen. It becomes a psychological necessity that, if not heeded, can result in unfortunate psychological and social results. When Tamagawa-san said that he had to step away from the anime industry after working in it for 5 years because of its all-consuming nature, he did so with a tremendous amount of foresight, saying that he would end up hating animating and drawing altogether if he didn't enter a hiatus. For 1.5 years he stopped drawing, mostly doing nothing and reading. Many think we as humans would enjoy this kind of total free time, but because we are so related to a society, it can become a very disorienting experience. This kind of absence in society, the drive to walk our own way, even if it doesn't make sense from a typical point of view, if it is done at the wrong point in time, can be dangerous. Not knowing how to spend your days, after living by a structure all your life before that, is something that brings up many inner uncertainties. I feel like especially nowadays, it also becomes a very different kind of experience because of how connected we are through the internet. This kind of spiral this can lead into is something I think we don't truly know the implications of yet. The reason I'm speaking on all this is because I want to point out that the path of individuation is a very lonely one. And really, it is the bedrock of creativity. A creation is by its nature amoral, simply because it is new. And it can only be truly created out of a tremendous inner conflict. When I see someone like Tamagawa-san pursuing such an incredible project for his own reasons, I feel hopeful about all the people in the world who are also on such a courageous path. As Jung said, in an age like ours that consists of many unpredictable societal changes, there yet exist a lot of people from whom you'd never expect an extremely unique perspective emerging, of which you might never heard of. He says that the people on a path like this are guarding their secret spirituality more than anything. Because the difficulty of pursuing such an inner life makes one come directly into contact with one's total incompetency. It is really so shameful that one would rather just close one's eyes to it. But it is these secrets that exist in individual souls that are the seeds of an uncertain future. And just like Tamagawa-san added in the description of Puparia, something is about to change drastically. We can only be witness to it. No one knows what the future will hold, but many of us feel that big changes are on their way. To be a witness to such a thing is easier said than done, because the overwhelming nature, which we can already see with how overwhelming technology is for us, requires an internal stability, which can never be attained through clever tricks, but only earned through pure honesty with oneself. The path to come into contact with these inner undercurrents that rule our life from our deepest dreams are generally not taken into consideration or noticed at all. Yet, they are the guiding myths of our life. And even if we would come up with any external technological wonder that might solve all the problems in our lives, there is an inner life that will remain empty and demand of us to stop fooling ourselves into believing that we could solve our life purely by external means. It's easy to dismiss ourselves and our perspective as ultimately subjective and irrelevant in the face of big changes. But what in humanity's history has ever been decided by anything else than our subjective tendencies? We would like to think we are able to be rational and objective creatures, but truly, something biased and subjective always ends up winning out in the end, for better or worse. In light of this, I think our small roles as individuals matter. Even if we consider the individual as the most negligible entity from a societal point of view, because it is the smallest minority. And ultimately, the soulful strength of this minority in the modern world that we exist in is most exceptionally expressed through the animation Puparia. Alright, this is enough. I'm so fucking tired. With this last scene, we might actually be entering an even greater mystery.